Hi, my name is Margaret, and I'm a student at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm like 20 and a half years old. I'm like pretty close to 21. My majors are microbiology and English, and I have depression. Whoa, you can't just like come out and say that kind of stuff, you know? Why not? Well, I mean, you just can't. Well, I mean, it's kind of important. The National Institute of Mental Health actually published a study that stated that in the last year alone, about 2.8 million adolescents, that's people from the age of like 12 to 17, experienced a major depressive episode within the past year. But even more than that, there's adults and elderly people who also are experiencing depression in the United States currently. And 2.8 million, that's already like a really big number. But I mean, when I first started this video about like a minute ago, you were all probably thinking similar thoughts to what other me was thinking. Just, you can't talk about depression, it's sort of taboo. But nobody ever really stops to ask, why is that? If I had a heart problem and I was on medication for my heart problem, people wouldn't be like, oh my gosh, that's so brave, or why do you need medicine for a heart problem? Can't you just like pull yourself together? And those are two very common stigmas that surround depressed individuals, is that they're brave, or they should suck it up. And sometimes they get a lot of pity, like, oh, poor you, your life must be so terrible. And then, of course, there's also a lot of fear, which kind of stems from the increased shootings in the United States, that, all people with mental illness are crazy. And that's not really the case. So I thought what I would do here today is just kind of give you some definitions, like what depression is, what are some stigmas surrounding depression, like what's a stigma in general. You might be sitting there thinking, I have no idea what that word is, what are you saying? Which, that's fair, like I understand, because we don't talk about mental illness, and that's the problem, from the research that I've done, studies have shown that the best way to educate people about depression is to just simply do that, like talk to people one-on-one kind of, and just sort of having contact with someone with a mental illness can already better inform people about depression and other serious mental illnesses. And so, while I'm not the most forthcoming person or outgoing, I decided I would share some of my story because I think that would help educate people about depression and how it works. So let's start with a definition. The American Psychiatric Association defines depression as a common and serious medical illness that negatively affects how you feel, the way you think, and how you act. And the most important word, I think, to note in that definition is serious. Like, you don't just walk up to someone and belittle their predicament, which I have gotten on occasion. I've had people tell me to pull myself together, or just kind of suck it up and try to get through a day, or like, stop being so sad. It's like, oh gee, stop being sad. You cured me. That was great. Thank you so much. Like, I can't. It's not something I can help particularly on occasion. Okay, but like, how would you recognize depression? If me or one of my friends or somebody I know is experiencing depression, like, how would I tell? I mean, if I asked you to name one symptom of depression, what would you say? Probably like pretty much everybody else, you'd say, oh, well, yeah, like you're sad or something. And yeah, that is one of the symptoms, but it's not just for like one day you're sad and then the next day you're good. It's more like you have to have some form of symptoms for 2 weeks before you're officially diagnosed as being a depressed individual. So the list of symptoms that it can include is feeling sad, like I said, or having a depressed mood, loss of interest or pleasure in activities once enjoyed, changes in appetite like weight loss or gain, trouble sleeping or sleeping too much, loss of energy or increase in fatigue, increase in restless activity or slowed movements and speech, feeling worthless or guilty, difficulty thinking, concentrating or making decisions, and thoughts of death or suicide. So a lot of those sounded really contradictory, and you can be like, wait, but how can you be like increased in fatigue, but then also increased in restless activity? And it's not really like that. Generally, you tend to kind of pick one. I mean, you don't personally, but your body tends to gear one way or the other. Like me personally, I usually lose interest in a lot of things and I feel really tired. And that's kind of why, instead of thinking of mental illness as just some thing that happens to people, that's why I tend to think of it, as a disease. Because when I am having those days where I'm not feeling much like myself, that's the thing. You don't feel like yourself when you're depressed. I like to call them bad brain days because, the brain is another organ, and sometimes you need medicine for it because it's not being a great brain at the moment. So that's kind of part of it. You have to think of it as just another disease that exists. So if what I'm saying is true, if depression is so serious, then why aren't people talking about it? Why aren't people sitting there like, man, that's a big deal. Maybe we should do something? And a lot of it is those stigmas that I was talking about earlier. I think I mentioned them all already, but the big ones are trying to control people. Oh, I didn't really touch on that. It's kind of like if you think, a lot of times what happens when people are diagnosed with depression is that people tend to believe they're less competent and capable of decision making. So people, usually parents, will try and make decisions for them so that they won't have to make these decisions themselves. And then the other ones are pity, like I talked about, and fear. And so what are the effects of these stigmas? The big thing with adolescents, which is the main group we need to reach out to, I believe, because depression usually starts around the age of puberty. And of course, these kids, if they don't know anything about depression, they're not going to know what's going on, and they're going to be scared. Then the other thing is, if you do know that you're depressed, or you expect that you're depressed, because there's these stigmas of fear and pity and all these things, people tend to look down on depressed individuals, which is really sad because it's like, I'm just a person trying to make my way through life. And that leads, especially with adolescents, to people not going to get help, because there are so many ways you can get help for mental illnesses. Especially at schools, there's counselors, there's a teacher that you could be particularly close to, there's your parents if you're close with your parents, siblings, friends. There's all sorts of people that you should be able to talk to about your problems. But, I mean, that brings me to, what do I do? How should I respond, So I think the best thing, if you're a peer of someone I'll say if you're a peer or if you're an adolescent with depression. If you're an adolescent with depression and you think that you need help, I would recommend, personally, to go to a counselor, because they are confidential. They're not going to tell anyone that you went to see them, and they can recommend help. And then from there, you can always go see a therapist, and therapists are really great. I know there's a lot of stigma surrounding them too, where people will be like, you go to therapy, and you sort of feel awkward telling people that you go to therapy too. But it's not all of that how do you feel? Tell me how this makes you feel BS that you see on TV and stuff. It's more like, how was your week last week? That's what I get asked a lot in therapy. How was your week since the last time I saw you? So that's mostly what therapists are for. Just a person you can talk to. You don't have to talk to them. You can sit there in silence for the whole hour. I've done that before on particularly bad days. I don't recommend it because it's really awkward, but you can talk to them the entire time about whatever you want, honestly. Okay, so in summary, we've talked about a lot here, so let me just wrap it up real quick. We talked about depression, what it is, what are the symptoms, how long you have to have the symptoms before you would be like officially diagnosed with depression, which is 2 weeks. And we also talked about what stigmas are and the effect that stigmas can have on people. So I just really want you all to remember, whether you have a mental illness or whether you don't have a mental illness, I just want you to keep in mind the fact that depression is serious. We don't ask for much from people many times because we're afraid to, because of stigmas, but just be there, be a good friend, and if you are a depressed adolescent out there, I strongly encourage you to get help if you think you need it. I understand that you might be afraid. You might be sitting there thinking, everyone's going to judge me, there's no one I can trust. And I understand where you're coming from. I understand completely. But if it's so bad that you're thinking that the world would be better off without you, that no one would miss you at all, that you're a failure or you're not worth it or something like that, like, no, I can promise you that that is not true. That is not you thinking that. That's just your sick brain telling you, hey, no one likes us, no one wants to be our friend. That's not true at all. So just sort of look out for yourself, okay? There's always someone that you can talk to. So please just keep what I've said here in mind, and let's go forward to kind of make the world a more accepting place. Thanks, everybody.